Hi, it's Craig with Craig's To-Do List, and I'm here with my Book Buzz segment. I'm speaking to a local author who lives right here in Jefferson County, Win Anderson, about his memoir called Wombat. Win, talk a little bit about how this book came about.
Absolutely. So I wrote it and published it in 2020. I was actually deployed at the time I finished it to Afghanistan, which the book is largely about. And I was also enrolled, I was finishing up my online master's degree in writing. So the book arose largely from my thesis for my master's. And one of the reasons I was writing as well is because writing is very therapeutic for a lot of people, and I'm one of those people. It provides like a form of literal catharsis of getting all those words out of your skull onto paper. Obviously, some of the experiences we have deploying can be somewhat traumatic, so getting those out there helps. So for my thesis, I just started assembling all these stories I'd written throughout the course of my creative writing studies. And I realized that they did form somewhat of a narrative, and I tried to incorporate a little more of a narrative arc, although it came out almost as more individual stories. But my thesis readers recommended that I perhaps consider compiling it, editing it a little bit, and trying to find publication.
And what is the title reference for those of us who maybe not are military oriented?
Absolutely. So the book was written by a soldier for soldiers, mostly, and soldiers tend to really get all the references, but sometimes my civilian friends have a little bit of a harder time.
It's like when I watch that show, The Pit on HBO. I need a glossary for yeah. So,
I haven't seen that one.
yeah. Well, you'll need a medical glossary.
Oh,
So
right.
every 2 minutes you're going to stop and go on your phone and look up something else.
Yep.
Sort of like what I was doing, but go ahead.
But Wombat references, so the platoon I was in was the 3rd platoon of attack company in the 1st of the 503rd Battalion, right? So you need a glossary already, right?
Right.
But our nickname, my platoon's nickname was the Combat Wombats. So that's where the title comes from, Wombat.
Cool. And when you started approaching, so the subject matter, there's a lot of really fun stuff in here, but there's a lot of really tough stuff.
Yep.
And I think your approach, from what I understand, has always been like, well, PTSD is something that people don't like to talk about. They don't know how to talk about. People don't know how to, it's almost just it's awkward for people to hear it because they don't know what to say to you. And your approach is sort of like a little bit tongue-in-cheek. And
Absolutely.
Was that helpful for you? Was that part of your therapeutic process, is to try to make it a little bit lighter so therefore you could push through the material? Was that sort of your angle?
Absolutely. It can be a very difficult subject matter for a lot of people. And there's one, I actually reference it in the book, but there's a coping mechanism. We call it gallows humor, and you can either laugh or you can cry. If you cry, that can be helpful, but a lot of times it's better to laugh about something. And so what I tried to do was utilize my natural personality, which is somewhat sarcastic, and I tend towards, humor, so that I could talk about it more organically and less uncomfortably. And I think for me, it was a much more realistic depiction of kind of daily life in the military, because it's equal parts like tragedy and comedy. There's a lot of humor, a lot of good times intermingled with the tough times and the difficult situations. And I really tried to portray that so that it, like you said, it helped people, it became more accessible for people to discuss.
I really liked when you were in the book, you were talking about how people are always trying to name PTSD and categorize it or label it, and it's been called shell-shocked. It's been called all these different things over the ages, and now it's a little bit too generic. And how just naming it and labeling it is another way to sort of keep people distant from it, as opposed to just addressing it directly. and does it really matter what it's called? And because we've all dealt with trauma in some capacity.
Absolutely.
So I'm just wondering, when you approach it from a more of an artistic angle or a creative angle like you have, were there some people? Do you think there are some people in the psychology field that just think, the only way to deal with PTSD is have a therapist and hang out? And what can you tell about your experience in dealing with it with creativity?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there can be, if you have too clinical of an approach to it, it's not a one size fits all type of thing. And everybody's, like you said, anyone can deal with trauma and can develop PTSD or other, illnesses related to it. But for me, I use a lot of coping mechanisms, a lot of techniques. And for me, one of those is definitely writing, creative writing, whether it comes in the form of poetry or in this case, an actual book. But other stuff works very well also outdoors, like hunting, fishing, hiking. So there's a lot of, I would say, creative outlets to cope with PTSD, which, like you just said, I hate that acronym. I think it's terrible. It doesn't sound literary either. It's awkward to say. But like shell shock, soldier's heart, combat fatigue, those all to me sound a little more literary. But those are just labels. What you're really dealing with is a collection of symptoms. And for me, the outlet of writing, that creativity, really helps relieve some of the burden on my mind. There's a ton of great programs that do it. There's an online one called Dead Reckoning that's for military veterans. They publish work, but they also do workshops. Like, this is a known way to help relieve some of the symptoms excuse me, of PTSD.
Right. I love the poetry, and so talk a little bit about poetry and mixing genres, right? That's another thing that you do really clearly here. It's like, there's a couple poems, then there's like a little story, and then there's poems again. And what about poetry? The immediacy and the sparseness of it is helpful for people who want to express themselves.
Poetry is a great outlet. I've written my whole life, but a lot of times, for me, within poetry, you can express things that there's no other way to express them, because you can't just write standard sentences or standard phrase. You have to. You can't just write standard prose. I meant you have to creatively express ideas and emotions and feelings that there's really no other way to express. And for me, a lot of times, some of my poetry and some of it that's been published was directly about experiences I've had in, combat. Others of it is more inspired by, nature and all of that. But all of it has some level of catharsis for me, some therapeutic value for me.
Right. Well, I'm just wondering how has this approach to dealing with the acronym that we're not going to mention right now, and the book itself, been perceived in the military community, or I should say, received in the military community? I'm just wondering, are there a lot of other soldiers or people that have served that are like, this is really cool, or do they just think, I don't know, it's just a wacky way to deal with it?
Actually, very well received. I have several friends who directly reached out to me after I published Wombat, thanking me for doing it, because they said it gave them another outlet, another thought of they never would have necessarily thought of writing as a way of therapy. But also, some of my friends who were there really appreciated it because it brought up memories, and it helped them relieve some stress and trauma that way. Also, obviously it's not 100% that everybody's gonna love the idea or even want to utilize it. Some people don't even read, let alone write,
Right.
And that's their prerogative, and they deal with their stuff in their own way. But I have a lot of friends. One of my friends reached out asking me about the process because he's interested in pursuing it. I need to follow back up with him, actually, and see where he is in it. But another one of my friends called, and he was actually like crying a little bit on the phone to me because he was like, man, I was at a low place in my life and I saw this come out and I read it and I was laughing and it helped relieve some of the stuff I was dealing with.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the publisher because I did a little, I Googled a little bit before I met you today about A15, and you were just telling us, unfortunately, a sad story about the guy who started this. I would like to talk a little bit about what the publishing company was and what kind of stuff and how it was a outlet for soldiers telling stories.
So Pete Donnelly was the publisher of A15 Publishing, and he recently passed away due to cancer. He had first had cancer years and years ago, and it was at least partially caused by, if not 100% caused by, burn pit exposure, which is kind of big in the news right now. Basically, open burn pits were on all the forward operating bases we were stationed on while deployed. And then his cancer was in remission, he got treatment, and then recently in the past 6 months, it came back strong, and he unfortunately, lost his battle, as they say, with cancer. But he started A15 Publishing, and he had a small group of employees, but really it was him. He was the glue that kept it together. And he did a lot of great work for veterans who, by getting their story out there, by giving them an outlet and then others an outlet by reading all these stories. Something else that my wife actually just mentioned to me before this, she was like, a lot of these books are in a way even more important now because the war in Afghanistan is over. So these are now historical novels about a 20-year period in our country's history where we had, the global war on terror, and at least the Afghanistan portion is completely over now.
Yeah. Well, I think it helps to write about those things and have those stories out there because, like you said, it was such a long period of time. I think Americans got so complacent as it went on and kind of forgot about it because it was so long, and it was kind of like there were not a lot of climaxes. It was just more of a constant thing. So I think it's really important for people to realize that, and it's great for soldiers to have an outlet. Super important, and I think what I like about this book and its approach, it kind of has a feeling of, it kind of has like a spontaneous feeling, like a poem, a story, and everything. And I think that's what makes it so accessible, because I think a lot of people go into reading and they expect a certain structure and they expect a certain type of format or formula where they've had with other books. And I think it kind of disarms that immediately, which I think is helpful, because then I think people are like, well, I got to pay attention because this isn't traditional. And I think that's helpful with a story. And I was just wondering, was that a conscious decision, or is that just an organic decision that just came out?
That's a very good observation by you, because it was a conscious decision. And what I was attempting to portray, and according to some, I probably did so a little too accurately, was the chaos that goes on in your head when you're experiencing like a PTSD attack, for lack of a better word. So as I mentioned in the book, when I started writing it, I was in my second really terrible episode of PTSD. It kind of almost can come and go in remission, or where you're having, acute symptoms as well. And I was trying to portray somewhat through the writing and the scattered nature of it and the voices in my head that I reference. I was trying to portray through writing what that feels like in your mind. So it was a conscious decision, and you're one of the first people to interview me to pick up on that. So that was very perceptive of you.
Well, I'm just wondering how so many other people that are having trouble expressing themselves, that are dealing with trauma, regardless if it's combat trauma or abuse trauma. I'm just wondering how difficult it is for them to deal with portraying that chaos in any kind of way that's accessible to somebody who hasn't done it. And I think that's what's important about this particular angle, is I think it makes it sort of accessible, like, oh, You know, I guess that's what they're really going through, and that's probably why you're getting the reaction from people who've read it, like that made me cry, or that was really it. I know exactly how that feels.
Laugh also, hopefully.
Right. Yeah. I think, you know, I think some of the most horrific situations, the only way they can be dealt with is laughter, because they're just so unreal.
Right.
You know, but making them real doesn't make any sense, even though they are. Great. And do we want to talk a little bit about anything else you're working on before we wrap up?
Just one thing I wanted to reference. It's kind of a random coincidence, but a friend of mine who was 10 feet from me in one of the firefights I reference in here when I was wounded is he's now in the Adirondacks. He's been out of the military for a while. And he started a charter fishing company called Battlefish Charters. And I'm actually now working for him, and we are doing a lot of stuff to try to help veterans to get them out on the water. And we're actually considering doing something along the lines of creative writing as well. We're still in the nascent stages of that, but it's my friend AJ Bodwin. I just wanted to reference him because he's doing a lot of great work. And
well, that's cool. Maybe there's a combo project of like writing the stories of the people that come there, or
we're workshopping it.
Yeah, you know? And how that helps. That's really great. And again, another angle or another way that to deal with the acronym. That is not traditional, correct? Right? So instead of just sitting in front of a therapist and trying to make that work, there's other ways to make it, you know, there's other ways to deal with it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I like that, the acronym. I might use that in something I write.
Yeah. Well, I have a story about that later, but all right, cool. Listen, everybody, check out Wombat. I'm going to put a link in the story on the website where you can go to A15 and order this. And Win, thanks for coming by today.
Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it as well.
Check out other stories, arts and entertainment, and Craig's To-Do List on our website. Thank you.